DOTR officials tried to commute from their homes to their offices. Transport experts earlier warned there were not enough public utility vehicles during the first day of GCQ. Commuters on Monday struggled to get to work amid the lack of transportation options. Some crowded inside military trucks and police vehicles, while others hitched rides with private vehicles. Senator Joel Villanueva points out the government seemed to have forgotten that workers rely on public transportation. He says, our economy has been the prime consideration in the decision to relax our quarantine restriction, but sadly, it appears we forgot about the mobility of our workers in our desire to jumpstart the recovery. But Transportation Secretary Arthur Togada denies there were no plans on public transportation.
Hindi ho totoo na walang plano. Meron ho mga plano at sa aming paglunsad at pagganap ng mga planong ito, naturalmente na merong mga taong nai-inconvenience.
He also says the situation will be replaced by, quote, a long-lasting convenience and connectivity and mobility of people.
Ang pakiusap ko lang ay magkapit-bisig tayo at intindihin natin yung estado at sitwasyon. Pagkat itong inconvenience na to sa aking pananaw at sa aking paniniwala ay temporary lamang.
Meantime, in an effort to ease mobility problems in the metro, advocates for bike-friendly roads in cities, Bikers United Marshals initiated a temporary bike lane to protect bicycle commuters. They set up bright orange 6-liter plastic bottles along Commonwealth Avenue for the improvised lane. Marshals were also present to ensure safety of the bikers. But Metropolitan Manila Development Authority spokesperson Celine Pielago criticizes the initiative as unsafe for other bikers. In response, the group hits back at the MMDA for not working on bike lanes for the public. The bike advocates say MMDA keeps on promising bicycle infrastructure, and to hear them say that it will take time before they take action to protect bikers is utterly disappointing. The Department of Health.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Junk the Real Terror, an online forum on Duterte's anti-terror bill. Thank you all for joining us here today. My name is Julie Hamora. I'm a member of the Malaya Movement National Secretariat. I'll be moderating our program for today. We are a broad movement of individuals, organizations, and various formations united under the common objective of defending human rights, democracy, and sovereignty in the Philippines. Before we get started, we'll go over the webinar etiquette for today's forum. So everybody will be on mute. The webinar is recorded and live streamed on the Malaya Movement Facebook page. You can comment, send your questions in the chat box, and you can direct them at questions. And we do encourage all of our participants today to rename themselves, and you can put your organization name, where you're tuning in from, your location. And if you are press, please designate yourself in your name as press. Can you hit the next slide, please? Okay, so before we get started, we know that recently this was the latest blow to freedom and democracy in the Philippines. Duterte at this time has moved closer to solidifying his full-blown fascist dictatorship with the recent passing of the anti-terrorism bill in both the House and the Senate. This is, we see it as the latest tool of the regime's tyranny and oppression against the Filipino people. During this forum, we have an incredible lineup of speakers ranging from lawyers, human rights defenders, activists from the Philippines and both here in the United States. And we'll break down exactly what is the anti-terrorism bill, what are its implications, and what does this mean for human rights and democracy in the Philippines. And most importantly, we'll talk about how we can take action. So we're just showing these slides very quickly, our calls to action, and we'll go into them in depth. But just know that we are here learning in this forum, and we do hope to move everybody to a place of action to show widespread opposition to the anti-terror bill in the Philippines, whether it's holding actions in front of your local Philippine consulate or the embassy in Washington, D.C. For Philippine Independence Day, publishing statements, open letters to register your opposition, phoning or emailing your concerns to the Philippine government, whether it's Malacanang or the Senate or the House, and our different phone lines that we have for the embassy and the consulate. And we do encourage people to be creative, make art, make media, inform your community about what's happening. And please, for today's forum, you can use the official hashtag #JunkTerrorBill. Next slide, please. And we'll have a script and we'll share it later in the presentation, but we do encourage those tuning in from the United States to call their local legislators to denounce the anti-terror bill, inform them about the 2 billion arms sale going to the Philippines amidst this COVID-19 pandemic, inform the legislators about our campaign to launch the Philippine Human Rights Act, and we'll go more in details to that. Next slide, please. Okay, so we are going to kick off our program. So our first speaker for today will be Jigs Clamor from Karapatan. They are the Deputy Secretary General of Karapatan, which is an alliance of human rights organizations, programs, human rights desks, and committees of people's organizations and individual advocates committed to the defense of people's rights and civil liberties through education and training, campaign and advocacy, services programs, documentation and research, as well as network building and alliance work. Let's give a warm welcome to Jigs, who will break down exactly what is the anti-terrorism bill. The floor is yours.
First of all, thank you for inviting Karapatan to be part of this forum. It is actually very timely given that the current Duterte administration has actually railroaded the passage of this new anti-terror bill. And we hope that by our concerted actions, we may still be able to persuade the sitting government to rethink, to reconsider its signing. Okay. Allow me first to share with you. Can we present my slide, please? Okay. Thank you. All right. Can we? Yeah. Okay. So this is not the new anti-terror law under the Duterte administration. But before I go further, I would like to briefly share this. Next slide, please. Okay. You may be all familiar with this song. No? It says, every breath you take, every move you make, every bond you break, every step you take, I'll be watching you. So in this song, it actually illustrates what happened before and what will happen after this anti-terror bill will be signed into law by President Duterte. Okay, next. Allow me to share with you a brief context of the human rights situation in the Philippines. Next slide, please. Actually, Karapatan documented more than 1,000 activists and political dissenters who were charged with common crimes. And in fact, as of today, there are 619 of them who are unjustly detained in different prison facilities here in the Philippines. Karapatan, under the Duterte administration, has also documented 308 victims of extrajudicial killings and 439 victims of frustrated killings of civilians and human rights defenders. They were accused as members of rebel groups and were also tagged, quote, communist terrorist groups by government officials. And the phenomenon of this red tagging, according to the recent report of the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner, which was released on June 4, 2020, says in the media release that the phenomenon of, quote, red tagging, labeling individuals and groups, including human rights defenders and NGOs, as communists or terrorists, has posed a serious threat to civil society and freedom of expression. In fact, Karapatan documented 245 organizations in the Philippines that were red tagged by state forces and government officials. I don't know if you have already heard what happened to the Facebook page uploaded by the PNP Regional Region 13 in Caraga against Bayan Secretary General Renato Reyes, no? And then very recently, I found out also that, including me, there was also a slide presented by the PNP it says there an anti-terrorist campaign showing my picture and a colleague of mine labeling us as a terrorist. And it says me that according to them, I'm a propaganda expert. Okay, next slide, please. Actually, before, when the Human Security Act was signed into law, several months after that, an indigenous people, his name is actually Edgar Candule, he was the first victim of this Human Security Act way back in 2008. With the help of the lawyers, we were able to release him. But when we appealed about the reparation, until now, it is actually pending because under the old Human Security Act, he's supposed to be paid 500,000 per day. But until now, that case has still been pending before the Court of Appeals here in the Philippines. Next slide, please. You may also recall that on February 21, 2018, the Department of Justice has filed a petition before a regional trial court in Manila prescribing a petition that asked the court to prescribe the CPP-NPA as a terrorist organization under the Human Security Act. No? Actually, that petition included more than 600 named individuals, and including 61 human rights defenders, 38 personalities, and one of the well-known personalities of these named individuals was the former Special Rapporteur Victoria Tauli Corpus of the Special Rapporteur on Indigenous People, and other well-known international indigenous peoples leaders, John Carlin, including our chairperson, Elisa Tita Luby. And because of our concerted efforts, this petition was up to date, actually was now still pending, but before, the names of these more than 600 individuals were now downgraded to only less than 10 persons, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, next slide, please. And then in January 2019, Dato Jomorito Goainon and Ireneo Odarbe were the two latest victims of this old law, no? The Human Security Act. They were charged with this in violation of this Human Security Act, Dato Jomorito Goainon and Ireneo Odarbe, and subsequently 4 members of the MOPA, the Misamis Oriental Farmers Associations, were also slapped with this anti-terrorist law. No, next slide, please. But again, what is this anti-terror bill? Okay, next slide, please. Allow me to just give you a brief background. In July 2019, it was Senator Lacson who actually refiled the bill that seeks the bill to amend the Human Security Act, and also a bill on anti-wiretapping law. Then next, please. Next, please. Okay. And you may also recall that in December 2019, when Delfin Lorenzana was asked whether is he willing to actually end the martial law in Mindanao, he said that he's very much willing, but there was a quid pro quo aspect on that. He said that, they are very much willing to end the martial law in Mindanao, provided that a new anti-terrorism law will be enacted into law. It was actually, he said this, that Filipinos can expect that the AFP will continue to push for the amendment of the Human Security Act, especially with Senate President Vicente Soto III. No? And then, next slide, please. And then just recently, on June 1st, Duterte certifies an urgent anti-terrorism bill, no, on June 1st. And then next slide. In less than 3 days, As expected, the Duterte allies passed the anti-terrorism bill, no, at the House of Representatives, no. Actually, the majority, overwhelmingly, majority of the members of the House of Representatives actually voted in favor of this anti-terrorism bill, totally disregarding the opinions, the position papers presented by human rights groups, international organizations, and other concerned citizens in the Philippines. Next slide, please. Uh, Next slide, please. One of the opposition legislators, Carlos Salate of Bayan Muna, described this bill. This is, according to him, this is terrorism against human rights. This is terrorism against our democracy. And according to Vice President Leni Robredo, she said that, is terrorism really the focus of the terror bill? Or it is just interested in giving the state the powers to call anyone a terrorist? Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, allow me to use, thank you very much for the NUPL for sharing this, a quick take on anti-terrorism bill. Well, what is really this anti-terrorism bill all about? It says here that under this new anti-terrorism law, it could punish at least discourage, restrain legal activity, exercise of freedom of speech and association, and in any form of platform, whether you're inside or outside the Philippines, because of its very broad and vague definition of what quote unquote terrorism or any related concepts. Just for the benefit of all the participants here, actually up to this date, there is no universally accepted definition of what terrorism is. But what is dangerous under this bill is that mere planning, proposal, or incitement, you can be held liable, you can be held accountable, no? Or you can be, yes, you can be held liable under this anti-terrorism law. And then second, it leaves a small group of unelected officials, all appointed by the president, and none of whom are judges, the almost absolute power to authorize the police and even the military to arrest without any warrant anybody that they quote unquote suspect, even wrongly, mistakenly, or maliciously as quote unquote terrorists, and detain them without charges for 2 weeks up to 24 days. And then, according to former College of Dean Shell Jokno, he said that by giving this small group of non-judicial officials, actually, they are actually usurps the judicial power. No, many with police and military background can actually use this with absolute power to designate, no, even if wrongly, again, mistakenly or maliciously, groups as quote unquote terrorists. Next slide, please. And then it allows such prolonged detention without charges being filed beyond what the 1987 Philippine Constitution says. Actually, there is only a maximum of 3 days. And then it allows the court to preliminary declare groups as quote unquote terrorists within 72 hours without any realistic and a fair chance to contest it. They actually remove a provision because in the previous Human Security Act, there is a need first to file a petition asking a local court to prescribe a particular group as a terrorist. But under this law, it allows the court to preliminary declare groups within 72 hours. No? And then it allows electronic surveillance and wiretapping of all kinds of any activity or form of speech that may not be really quote unquote terrorists for 3 months. And then it permits access to database of personal information, back records, and private communication, and freezing of private assets. No? And then, actually, even before the passage of this bill, the RMP has already, the Rural Missionaries of the Philippines has already experienced the brunt of this anti-money laundering law, no, freezing their accounts because they were suspected as supporting so-called terrorist organization. And then the supposed safeguards are canceled out by qualification and preconditions and wide discretion on the part of police, military, and executive branch, and which are not observed in practice, even with already many laws, rules, and conventions on rights, and that practically no one is held liable for violations. Next slide, please. Okay. Actually, in summary, the new anti-terror law will only result in a chain of oppressive acts. Imagine warrantless arrest, surveillance, detention for a long period of time, freezing of accounts, name it. Almost all that are supposedly protected under the 1987 Bill of Rights will now be violated, no, under this new terror law. Next slide, please. The question is, how can we find it? How can we fight it? Okay, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, just like any other activist, no, whether you're in the Philippines, you're in abroad, one of the basic tasks that we are supposed to do is actually to continue to arouse, organize, and mobilize the masses, especially those who are actually, they lack the information. That's why this kind of forum is very relevant to really educate the public about this anti-terror bill. And then second, next slide, please. Let's continue to voice our opinions and dissent. I included this an article from the Rappler. It says here that the writers are Patricio Abinales and Lisandro Clodio. It says here that we already know that repression doesn't work. Marcos tried it and he earned himself the moniker of, quote, the NPA's best recruiter, no? Because during that time, the Communist Army swelled from roughly from 2,500 troops in the late 60s to over 20,000 in the early 80s. So, I mean, I don't know. Of course, many of us maybe have watched a Netflix. I think this War Machine. It says here the counterinsurgency of math is that 10 minus 2 is not actually 8, but it is equals to 20 because you're just creating more enemies than really addressing what's really the problem of this quote and unquote terrorism. Next slide, please. And then third is to further strengthen our networks and build international solidarity for people's rights. Kapatid, in their statement, they said that we call on all Filipinos to remain vigilant together. Let us firmly stand up and resist any attempt that will further violate our rights. Because, of course, we strongly believe, and this is actually very alarming, that even without the passage of this anti-terrorism bill, many have actually already experienced how totally the impunity here in the Philippines, especially if you are just voicing out your dissent, voicing out your grievances. If you're against the government, remember many were already arrested because of their posts, because they were just voicing out their position against the Duterte administration. Okay, and then next slide, please. Lastly, actually, for Karapatan to really, Karapatan believes that terrorism can be addressed not through a defective military approach that our state forces employ, but through the pursuit of a just and lasting peace. Tackling the roots of, through the pursuit of a just and lasting peace, tackling the roots of the problems of social injustice and inequality, and through genuine respect for human rights. And marami pong salamat. Next slide, please. So I will just, maraming salamat at maybe later we will just wait for the questions. I think some of the speakers will also tackle some of the major provisions of this anti-terror bill. Thank you very much again. In the Philippines, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jigs from Karapatan, for really laying down the foundation of our understanding of the anti-terror bill and the human rights violations that will ensue due to the overbroad definition of terrorism, the jurisdictions that span borders, extended surveillance, detention, and violations of Filipinos' constitutional rights, and leaving us with some calls to action and the importance of organizing around this issue. So for our next speaker, if you could hit the next slide. I'd like to welcome Neri Colmenares, who is a human rights lawyer and activist. He was an associate of the Asian Law Center at Melbourne Law School when he was completing his PhD in law on the writ of amparo and the International Criminal Court. He also lectured at the University of Melbourne on the International Human Rights Law and the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Neri Colmenares presently holds the following positions. He's the co-chairperson of Makabayang Koalisyon ng Mamamayan, chairperson of Bayan Muna Party List, bureau member of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, and the vice president of Confederation of Lawyers in the Asia Pacific. Neri, the floor is all yours, and he'll be speaking further about Duterte's terror law. Why is it needed at this time, and why is he using it as a tool of repression? Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. And greetings to all who are viewing or listening to this forum. I'm very glad you invited me here, but more importantly, because you held such a very, very necessary and relevant and timely forum on the issue. The topic given to me was on the need of Duterte for the terror law in the midst of pandemic. Why the sudden rush? And of course, its implication, not just on human rights advocates or activists, but on the entire Filipino people. So before that, first, let's put this issue to rest. The authors have always said that, oh, we need to rush the terror bill because to protect the Filipino people. Well, it's not really true. There is a terror law now in the Philippines. It's called the Human Security Act. And in fact, hello, can you still hear me? Yes. Oh, hello?
Your video is off, Neri, but we can still hear you.
Yeah. Oh, somebody's calling me, so that's why. But anyway, audio is the more important thing. So anyway, yeah. So there is a law, the Human Security Act, that punishes the so-called terrorists. In fact, I mentioned before, if the Abu Sayyaf will bomb Metro Manila, not only the terror law, but even without the terror law, our laws are sufficient to go after them. In fact, I said, just a bomb joke, you can be arrested. How much more if you're wearing a suicide vest or something? That's their example. And more importantly, drug suspects die in the Philippines. So why would they suddenly need a terror law against terrorists? If you're a drug suspect and you die, how much more if you're an Abu Sayyaf suspect or a terrorist suspect? So it really exposes the fact that there's really no need, not just to rush, but there's even no need for a terror law. So what is the intention of rushing this in the midst of pandemic? And the analysis there is really, as Jigs mentioned, it's really for the dissenters, the activists, and people complaining. Why did Duterte need this? Because of the growing discontent among the people. There is a growing discontent now in the Philippines for three reasons. First, President Duterte has a lot of broken promises, and that really riles the people because they voted for him on those promises. The second is, of course, the ineffective, incompetent handling of the COVID response. A lot of people are really suffering today. And thirdly, because of his continuation of already the policies of government that impoverishes people. So basically, those are the main points why there is growing discontent. What are the promises? Well, I can mention China. A lot of people probably voted for him because he said, "Oh, I will defend the country from Chinese expansionism in the West Philippine Sea." And turns out, 180-degree turn. He goes around, becomes very friendly with China at the expense of the Filipino people's sovereign rights in the West Philippine Sea. Well, there are many. He promised contractualization will be ended under his term and still rampant now. A lot of workers are contractual. He also promised, of course, to eliminate drugs in 6 months, and it became 1 year, and now it's more than 3 years, and he hasn't really made a dent on that. So a lot of broken promises, and the Filipino people are fed up with this traditional politician type of promising things without any intention of implementing it. The second reason is the ineffective and not just ineffective, corruption-driven COVID response. In the first place, there was a delay in the response. As late as February of 2020, he was still, trivializing the COVID response, and he even said, "I'll show me the virus and I will slap it," And if you notice in the response itself, the government was scrambling all throughout at the expense of the Filipino people. In fact, many of the frontliners died because they were lack on PPEs, in equipments. The aid to the people was precisely delayed, if not insufficient. Millions don't still have the sufficient aid that government promised or the people needed. And of course, corruption endemic in the implementation of the fund. And we spent 2.5 months, more than 2.5 months in quarantine, hoping the government will be ready by the time we go into, general quarantine situation. But no, they're still scrambling until now, and a lot of people are afraid. That's why there are rallies and protests and Facebook and so on, saying Duterte, gago ka, which was not really that situation before. The problem there is the militarist solution of President Duterte, which is the answer to people going out in the streets is to arrest them. When in fact, the very reason why people go out in the streets in violation of the quarantine rules is precisely because they need to eat. There's no food for the family tonight. So instead of addressing that and looking at dissent or violations as a feedback mechanism for government to improve their services, the resort was arrests of people, not just ordinary people, but even people who are protesting, especially people who are protesting, either rallies or other protest actions, whether online or in the streets. Just a note, because there's a big rally tomorrow. No law prohibits rallies in the Philippines. And that's really horrible for the police to say, well, rallies are prohibited now. There's no such thing. And secondly, even the quarantine rules, even the Bayanihan Law, and even the Republic Act 11332, or the mandatory reporting of infectious disease, they do not say rallies are prohibited and that you can arrest people holding rallies. So, but that's how the response was. And it really worsened the situation. The third reason is Duterte's persistence in following the policies other than human rights policies that are repressive, but even the economic policies that have proven that they couldn't save the people from poverty. And what it is, the globalization, of course, the regulation, privatization, contractualization. That's why people are poor. First 2 days of the lockdown, farmers couldn't find food anymore because they were hard hit by the liberalization of rice importation. Contractual workers are almost 65%, according to one study. That's why workers go hungry in the first 2-3 days of the lockdown, because no work, no pay. You're contractual, so that's it for you. So the urban poor is so huge, the government even finds it hard to list them down. because they're hard hit. And all this come from an economy that has long been discredited. Economic strategy, I mean, that has long been discredited. So he needs this to quell that dissent. It's not intended to quell terrorism. It is intended to quell dissent, which is growing by the day because of the government response. So implications, as Jigs mentioned, are there. Section 29 would say that the Anti-Terrorism Council can issue a warrant of arrest. Well, they call it in the law written authorization. That's the same. A warrant of arrest to issue a suspect. So, and you go to prison for 24 days. So, actual implications, for example, there's a big rally tomorrow. Why don't you arrest the leaders today? And just detain them for 14 days and then the rally's kaput, right? There's the section, it's the executive. The Anti-Terrorism Council is the executive, as Jigs mentioned. Can the executive issue a warrant of arrest? Of course not. That's why the Constitution practically prohibited it, because at the time of Marcos, the president issues warrants of arrest through the arrest, search, and seizure order. I was a victim of that when I was a young student. I was with Student Catholic Action, merely demanding for the return of student councils and student papers. And Marcos issued the ASO against me, and I was in prison for a total of 4 years, just because I was fighting for. So the issue of definition of terrorism on part of government has been there all along, that anyone who disagrees, anyone who dissent, label them as terrorists, and that's it. So, proscription. Well, Jigs mentioned the judicial prescription under Section 26 of the law, but they've actually inserted a new provision, Section 25, which is the designation of an organization or individual as a terrorist. And that's an executive function again. The ATC issues that. No judicial processes at all. No forum where you can submit your evidence to show I'm not a terrorist. That's why their judicial prescription is, it failed now under the law, because precisely that they just keep on charging people as terrorists without any evidence at all. So now, rather than change their ways and just charge people who they have evidence on terrorism, they reverted to Section 25 of the new terror law, which is that the ATC designates a person terrorist, and that's it. Your accounts are frozen. You can be arrested under Section 10 of the bill. So really, grabe, it really could hit hard on those dissenting against President Duterte. Last point before I go to my conclusion, there are no safeguards. They've always mentioned, there are safeguards there. But the safeguards are non-existent because while constitutional rights are protected and are not defined under terrorism definition, but still, they say unless your intention is to endanger another person's life. So it goes back to the intention. Just note that the terror bill is a law that penalizes intention, not the acts. You may not have bombed, but you intended to bomb. And that's how government gets away with it. So in conclusion, those are the implications, and those are the reasons why President Duterte need to rush this terror law. What do we do? Jigs mentioned it, but we are in the midst of pandemic, and I think it's really very hard on the people, this pandemic and the repression of the rights. But notice, this crisis actually exposed the ineffectiveness of the government policy of the day, whether it's a human rights policy or an economic policy in the face of a crisis like COVID. This is a rare opportunity where it's clear to the people that the rottenness of the system, globalization, deregulation, all this US and China policies, they didn't work. And it's about time we chart our new economic order, our new human rights policies that are effective in responding to crises such as COVID. And I guess that's where we press strong. While we press strong for the junking of the terror bill, we press strong also for social reforms. the next time around, if ever another crisis such as this comes around, then we can manage to face it better than this. I know it's hard, but if you look at our history, the most important victories of the Filipino people came at the time of the worst crisis. And this is probably one reason to encourage us to press for social reforms. It will be long, it will be hard. We've been fighting for human rights for years. But you know what? We have persisted on the battle against repression because we believe that we will win the battle against repression because we are on the side of the truth. We will win this battle against repression because we are on the side of the just. And we will win this battle against repression because we are on the side of the Filipino people. Maraming salamat po. Good day to all who are listening today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nery Comaneres of Makabayan Coalition and also of Bayan Muna. And for really reminding us that we, while under this intense repression, the crackdown on dissent, that it really is in response to the inadequacy of the Duterte's government in responding to the social inequalities in the Philippines. So together we'll all stand in justice, on the right side of justice, and fighting for the Filipino people. So for our next speaker, we'd like to invite a speaker from the United States. Their name is Suzanne Adley. They're the co-chair of the National Lawyers Guild International Committee and a member of the International Association of the Democratic Lawyers. They recently participated in a delegation to the Philippines last year under the IADL to monitor the targeted harassment and killings of lawyers and other human rights defenders. They'll be speaking today on the anti-terror law and what are its implications for Filipino nationals abroad, the Filipino diaspora organizing overseas, and also the wide-sweeping jurisdiction that in this broad language within the law that seems to target even overseas activists. So give a warm welcome. Thank you, Suzanne, for being here today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Julie. So the National Lawyers Guild and the IADL learned about this act, I think, last weekend. And in recent days, we have been working on an open letter expressing our deep concern, actually, our outrage over the human rights implications that we see coming from this act, and particularly as we see motivated by the state's intent to suppress speech and association and suppress and silence dissent. We are probably going to send those letters any minute now to Duterte, to the Department of Justice, and to congressional members, urging them to either veto or reverse their vote on the act. I'd also like to mention that there was also a statement that was published by the Confederation of Lawyers in Asia and Pacific, COLAP, and I just wanted to read an excerpt from their statement, which says, "The bill violates the sovereign rights of states and the internationally mandated norm that criminal jurisdiction is confined to the territories of a state because of the provision on extraterritorial jurisdiction. It applies to any person of whatever nationality or citizenship outside of the Philippines who may commit acts constituting terrorism against the Philippines government in any place in the world. Any person who may fall under the very broad and vague definition as terrorists may be arrested or extradited by the Philippine government. The assets of these foreigners or Filipino citizens may be frozen and confiscated by the Philippine government." This excerpt from the statement is referring to a provision in the Act, Section 49, as they described it, the section on extraterritorial application. I did do a screenshot of it, but in case you wanted me to share my screen, would you like me to? Or it doesn't matter. I mean, it basically is the provision that says that this broad, overbroad, and vague definition of terrorism or support for terrorism or incitement for terrorism will apply to Filipino nationals living abroad, as well as nationals of other nationals living abroad. It does state that in that regard, the Filipino government will exercise, jurisdiction, whether or not the act was committed in the Philippines or outside of the Philippines, but they were exercise jurisdiction if that individual is inside of the Philippines, and that individual will be referred to the by the Anti-Terrorism Council to the BI or the Department of Justice for either deportation or prosecution. So I just wanted to say that, that particular provision is alarming, and it is sort of the basis of this excerpt from the statement from COAP, saying that the bill violates sovereign rights of states and further violates the international human rights of potentially solidarity activists living abroad or Filipino activists living abroad. But even with that, I don't think that we want to claim that by just kind of reading it today and hearing about the act today that we know what the full implications of this will be, right? But I think that my colleagues and I are committed to analyzing this act should it be made law, and sort of analyzing what the Filipino government does and what the US government does, and sort of paying attention to what those implications might be. We think that, when we look at this piece of the act, it reminds us again of US anti-terrorism law, right? And we know that the Philippines is the Philippine government's anti-terrorism law is very much influenced by US's own anti-terrorism law, like the Patriot Act. We also have an overbroad definition of material support for terrorism. I don't know if you know about the 2010 decision by the Supreme Court that also defined material support for terrorism as expert advice or training, among other things. And we ask ourselves is this sort of now, and the U.S. has used its anti-terrorism laws and its call for a war on terror to justify actions like extraordinary rendition of suspected terrorists, as they have done for many, many years, to places like Libya, Egypt, and Syria, and Saudi Arabia, etc. And US anti-terrorism law has also been used to justify US military actions, sometimes covert actions, sometimes direct military actions, in the name of going after suspected terrorists, etc. So, when we look at this, it sort of leads us to sort of ask the question, is sort of the Philippines seeking to also broaden out its ability to fight political dissent outside of its own territory? And we think that, among the motivations to put forth a treacherous act like this is the really sort of effective, strong international activism, solidarity activism that has been happening, and bringing attention to the human rights issues within the Philippines, whether that be in the form of lobbying or media or conferences, or just building awareness about the social issues, the human rights issues, the killings in the Philippines, etc. Then that work has been very, very effective, as well as many delegations who've gone to the Philippines, and but what we want to remind everyone is that, you know, we're not looking at this and saying to ourselves that we need to be fearful of you know, what the implications might be if we can continue to act in solidarity with the movement, social movements in the Philippines, or the movement to you know, create accountability for the human rights abuses in the Philippines. But what we do see is that this moment is an important moment to increase our international solidarity. And it's as important as ever. But it is also kind of a call for us to, you know, I would say be vigilant, but I know that Duterte used that same language. So I would say to sort of be committed to building these solidarity movements, whether through the Malaya movement or through lawyers who are in solidarity with Filipino lawyers or others. We continue to build those movements in a way where we are considering how we can strengthen our ability to keep each other safe, right? And I think that that's going to take commitment from us to really monitor monitor how this act progresses in the United States, I mean, in the Philippines, monitor sort of the rhetoric around the, you know, the passage of the act and the rhetoric around terrorism in the Philippines. But, you know, a lot of people sort of look at language like this and might kind of think about worst case scenarios like, well, can a Filipino activist living outside the US or an activist not a Filipino descent be sent to the Philippines to be tried for allegedly committing an act under the ATA? But, you know, I don't think that the worst case scenario is necessarily the most important thing to think about right now, because there are other ways in which this can manifest. And one of the most basic ways that it can manifest is things like the surveillance of our movements here in the United States, right? And surveillance and monitoring and the ways that they try to also tag or label activists outside of the Philippines, in the United States and elsewhere, as sympathizers or supporters of terrorism. And I mean, I've heard about, was it a state-sponsored tour of indigenous leaders last year that went to speak in various cities around the country from the Philippines, in which in those sessions they tagged or labeled some of the solidarity organizations in the United States as supporters of terrorism or sympathizers of terrorism. So things like that, those are the kinds of things that we need to look out for. And you know, and it's not just about sort of what the actions of the Philippines government might be. It's also about what the actions of United States and United States forces might be. And to ask ourselves, well, what is sort of the status of security cooperation between the US and the Philippines? And I say this because, you know, I have studied through my work, or I have known through my work, the ways in the US has some very, very deep security cooperation structures with other states, right? And Julie mentioned that I was part of a delegation to the Philippines last year, and when I returned to the United States, I was questioned at JFK Airport by the border police inside of a room. And usually that happens when I'm coming back to the United States from countries in which I know that the United States has a deep sort of relationship with, in terms of anti-terrorism security cooperation or military cooperation. like when I returned from Egypt, or when I returned from Israel, and when I returned from Jordan. And it happened also when I returned from the Philippines. So for me, that's sort of a red flag that there's sort of discussions happening between the states when international activists are going to the Philippines or returning to the Philippines. I don't exactly know what that looks like, but perhaps that's something that we could study. When Filipino activists and solidarity activists are traveling to the Philippines on delegations or for other reasons, and are coming back to the United States and are having sort of a hard time getting back in or being questioned, I mean, we perhaps could employ some tools like Freedom of Information Act to acquire records from the agencies that were part of this harassment in order to find out more about what that security cooperation might look like. Now, when I sort of mention these other states in which the U.S. sort of collaborates in their sort of anti-terrorism mission, those are different circumstances. I mean, the United States and Israel have a very sort of long-standing relationship, and they collaborate with each other on many, many levels, from targeting right down to the prosecutions in U.S. courts. And it's not necessarily the same with the Philippines. And I don't think that the United States necessarily has the same political motivation to engage in supporting the Philippines' anti-terrorism mandate as the United States does when it comes to countries like Israel and Egypt. But we need to also kind of monitor, whether or not that political motivation changes. And what I mean by that is this, is that, we look at the Philippines and, we see it as being very unstable in many, many ways, politically, economically, etc. The United States looks at the Philippines and sees it as stable, or stable enough that doesn't threaten U.S. interests. And I think that, if the United States begins to sort of see the Philippines as being destabilizing as it relates to U.S. interests, that the political motivation to cooperate with the Philippines and in this kind of call to go after alleged terrorists could change the situation. So that's something that we also need to monitor as well. And I know that many of you are working to oppose the arms deal, for example, between the U.S. and the Philippines. And I encourage you to continue to do that. And that kind of activity, I think, is also sort of a good place to be observant and to be astute as to the different sort of conversations that you're having with congressional members, and whether or not those conversations change, right? And perhaps also it could be useful for us to use some legal tools to also acquire records to find out what some of those internal conversations have been. And I think, all I can really say is that, you all should continue your work. We all should continue our work, and we need to, be committed to paying attention, being observant. So monitoring what's coming out of the Philippines, monitoring how activists sort of might be harassed or surveilled here in the United States or elsewhere. And then sort of work together to think about, how to sort of strengthen our security culture and our movements, and, how also to be prepared and to be ready if we do see, the worst case scenario consequences of this act. Of this act on any of our colleagues or friends or activists, both here and in the Philippines. And so I'll end by saying that, whatever the National Lawyers Guild could do to help, just let us know.
Thank you so much, Suzanne of the National Lawyers Guild, and for really highlighting the importance of international solidarity and being very vigilant, doing our research and working together at this time to oppose these very repressive policies. Not only is it the anti-terrorism bill, but it's also the US arms sales that are going to the Philippines from our US tax dollars that are known to commit human rights violations to our Filipino people. So thank you so much for your continued solidarity. And we'll be sure to send out and highlight the International Association of Democratic Lawyers open letter. And if you could hit the next slide, we are going to go back to speakers from the Philippines. So up next, we have Luigi Trinidad, who is a spokesperson of the Youth Movement Against Tyranny, or YMAT, an alliance of student councils, student publications, and youth formations that aim to unite all freedom-loving Filipinos to not allow regimes of tyranny and fascism set upon our nation once more. And Luigi will be speaking on what is happening, what are the implications and concrete impacts on people's movements, and what is the response of people's movements in the Philippines to the anti-terrorism bill. Luigi, the floor is yours.
Hello, yeah, thank you for inviting the Youth Movement Against Tyranny. Okay. So we know that many lawyers, human rights groups, church journalists, youth groups, other sectors, and even just concerned citizens have ably explained the dangers of the anti-terrorism bill as they see it will affect them. The bill being railroaded during the pandemic was a betrayal of public trust, where government response is failing and seeing only a continued rise in cases after 77 days of lockdown. And despite the government's double talk of the cases going down, still, there has not been a day since May that the cases are below 100. The bill was railroaded during a time when workers and commuters don't even have transportation, when jeepney drivers are driven to garbage scavenging or begging in the streets, or an aspiring OFW died after being stranded, unable to go home to their province and sleeping 4 nights in a Pasay footbridge and then dying there, only to discover she has COVID-19. The government is making a big travesty out of the people suffering much more during the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. And just yesterday, Senator Panfilo Lacson, one of the bill's main authors and principal sponsors, said that those who oppose the bill have run out of sound reasons and have shifted to target the implementation of the bill. He said it is a case of arguing basta lang, or just because. However, it is Lacson and Senate President Tito Soto who have resorted to ad hominem arguments or attacks on an opponent's character rather than by an answer to the connections made, saying those opposing did not read they are terrorists of supporters of terrorists or supporters of terrorists, and in the bill, the supporters of terrorists are actually among those they can use the anti-terrorism bill to detain, conduct surveillance, or charge. But the adverse effects of the bill may result to not mere imagination. They are already happening, but police had to break protocol, set up a checkpoint or office raid, and then plant evidence, among others. So many things to fabricate just to get one activist in jail must have been so tiring for them. Now they can suspect a person as terrorist and then arrest or detain them for 24 days, and during the detention, then release them after they have found nothing, just to break their will. Sometimes they can even collect evidence, incriminate the person while the detention is happening, and even breaking their will. Soto, the National Security Advisor, and National Security Advisor Hermogenes Esperon said the anti-terrorism bill is a better tool than martial law. It is as if it is normal or acceptable in a supposed democracy to live in permanent martial law. That's why Duterte has been saying, oh, this is the new normal. It's better, it's the best thing. And it's reminiscent of dictator Ferdinand E. Marcos's New Society, right? So what has been happening in the country since red tagging became deadly during the administration of Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, whose counterinsurgency plan, Oplan Bantaylaya 1 and 2, did not differentiate between activists with placards and revolutionaries with guns, led to hundreds of extrajudicial killings, is what the anti-terrorism bill is trying to legalize through the anti-terrorism bill. Duterte's counterinsurgency programs, Executive Order 70, forming the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, Memorandum number 32, declaring a state of lawless violence in Bicol region, Negros Island, and Samar, giving rise to peasant killings, now at 250, is what the anti-terrorism bill is trying to legalize through the anti-terrorism bill. Some examples of things that are already happening even without the anti-terrorism bill, and with it would exacerbate sorry. Wait. I'm so sorry. Exacerbate human rights violations and targeting of activists and ordinary citizens. First, fake Facebook accounts. The proliferation of fake or dummy Facebook accounts are the handiwork of government, and that has deployed trolls long ago, but increasingly and more. The fake profiles can be manipulated, which can be used later on as basis to file trumped-up charges against the real owners of the accounts. The victims could have been suspects under repressive laws such as the Cybercrime Prevention Act and the Human Security Act, or the new terror law, if signed by Duterte, said Bayan Metro Manila. And, we as the Filipino people have to fight this terror bill because it's just not right. If back then GMA was able to kill thousands of people and Duterte surpassed that, then it's a call for us to continue to junk terror bill and to continue calling for mass testing now, ayuda para sa lahat, and solusyong medikal, hindi militar. In times of crisis, the people's rights must be upheld. If there is a true terrorist in the Philippines and the world, this would be the police, the military, and Duterte. The Duterte government has always been a fascist regime who attempts to deceive the people. However, it can no longer excuse itself, as its fascism can no longer hide its irresponsibility. So let's hold the Duterte administration accountable. And state fascism and tyranny, aus Duterte. And that is all for the youth movement against tyranny stand. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you so much, Luigi, from the Youth Movement Against Tyranny, and really putting a face to what tyranny looks like on the ground and how activists are impacted and the need to resist. So for our next speaker, we're going to invite Cara Tagua from the League of Filipino Students. She is the national spokesperson of the League of Filipino Students, the leading anti-imperialist youth organization in the Philippines, dedicated to mobilizing the youth toward genuine freedom and democracy. And Cara will specifically speak on the impacts of activists and how the youth and students are fighting back. The floor is yours.
Yeah. Hello. Greetings to everyone who's listening to our discussion today. I'd like to share my screen. I prepared a short presentation.
Okay. We're gonna have to I think tabs, you'll have to change the share screen settings.
Is it working?
Yes, there we go. It's loading up. Okay, we see it now.
All right. Okay. So before I begin with the recent attacks on the youth, I would like first to establish how the youth in the history of the Philippines has always been at the forefront of fighting for genuine democracy and social change. And the League of Filipino Students, one of the organizations established during the time of Marcos martial law, was one of the youth organizations that mobilized the people, the youth and the Filipino people, in order to bring back the student councils, organizations, and student publications, along with joining the Filipino people in successfully ousting the fascist dictator Marcos. So even prior to the Duterte administration, the youth has been mobilizing in thousands of numbers in order to fight for democratic rights, not only for the right to education, but also in joining the Filipinos' fight for against contractualization, for higher wages, for land for the farmers, and other democratic rights of the Filipino people. So under the Duterte administration, the youth has been um, organizing walkouts from our schools in order to just amplify our calls regarding education and social issues, and the response of the government to the calls of to the demands of the youth is further fascism, further curtailing of democratic rights and academic freedom. So under the Duterte administration, further repressive policies were implemented in campuses, curtailing the right to organize and to express, the right to peaceful assembly, even the censorship of student publications, and the defunding of student institutions as forms of silencing the youth, especially at the time of the victory for free education in state universities and colleges. Implementing haircut and dress code policies even during the pandemic, wherein people or the students are attending online classes, and the proposed mandatory random drug testing, wherein they want to test even elementary students for if wherein they want even elementary students to undergo mandatory random drug testing as an excuse for police presence within schools and universities. Recently, the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict was established, and one of the sections of this institution wants to intervene with the implementation of academic policies within universities. They want to evaluate and review the different curriculum, activities, and programs within universities. They want to enforce police presence and military presence within universities, and even to investigate student violence against
Kara, are you there? Seems like we have a little glitch.
the
Kara, can you hear us? Oh, we might have lost Kara. Okay, so while we get Kara back on the line, I think we will just have to move to our next speaker, and then we can continue with Kara's presentation afterwards. So if we can get it back on the screen. Okay, so up next, we're going to have a statement by Malaya Arevalo from the Malaya Movement National Secretariat, our position on the anti-terror bill. So welcome, Malaya.
Hey, thank you. So, one, I want to say thank you to everyone that's attended and to all of our guest speakers that's come from the Philippines, and to Suzanne, who came here from, the NLG. Malaya movement really joins the call to junk the terror bill, and we call on all Filipinos at home and those in the diaspora, especially here in the United States, to join us in continuing to defend and uphold civil and democratic rights in the Philippines. When we think about this rush job of the Anti-Terror Act, we really have three main concerns. One, the overly broad definitions of terrorism. Two, the specter of a police state, and three, the implications for Filipinos abroad. Luckily, because I know we're running out on time, a lot of these points had already been discussed. But the first point, really around the definitions, we're really worried, that this new bill widens the scope way too far, opening the doors for, possible abusive interpretations by the state, and those interpretations may impact the public's ability to exercise their constitutional freedoms. We see under Section 9 of HB 6875 that inciting to terrorism can be committed by means of speeches, proclamations, writings, emblems, banners, or other representations of the same, punishable by 12 years in prison. And so, it's not improbable for us to, wonder what a future could look like under this law, whether or not a poster or a placard or social media post, online, a meme that someone creates, a speech made at a rally, or even a political t-shirt can be put under scrutiny and suspicion. We worry about the increasing presence of a police state, right? It's already been spoken of that there are provisions in the bill that allow powers to conduct warrantless arrests, detentions of 24 days without formal charges, which is already 8 times longer than currently provided for. Surveillance of suspected individuals up to 90 days. During this time, your personal information, private communications, bank records, your assets could be frozen. All of those things are surveilled and monitored. But what's surprising to us as a movement is that there are no more safeguards and accountability of the government for unfounded charges, right? And we know that there's a history of planted evidence. We know that there's a history of false witnesses. We see that last year in the fall, there were urban mass arrests of activists and journalists, and that there were, evidence planted by police and military. And so we are worried about this. And that there's going to be a persistent culture of impunity. For Filipinos living here in the United States, of course, we wonder how this law will apply to us here, especially for those of us who continue to defend democratic rights in the Philippines, to uphold human rights in the Philippines, and hold those in power accountable. In 2018, there was a Senate press release by the Philippine Senate just this past fall, where they say that they wrote measures to cover Filipino nationals who commit terrorist offenses abroad, and to establish Philippine jurisdiction over Filipino nationals who may join the fight with terrorists outside the Philippines. So obviously this is a major concern for us, right? We know though, here in the US, in San Francisco, in October of 2018, the Department of Foreign Affairs released a press statement saying that there was an established partnership between the SF Consulate General and the police community and the PNP, the Philippine National Police, creating something called the Police Community Relations Group. And in the press release, they say that they want to establish global police community relations to help open the doors for other international law enforcement agencies to do partnerships with the PNP. So for us, especially when we're taking a look at the anti-terror bill and these provisions around the definitions of terrorism, and their intent to, reach across the seas to Filipinos here, we can't help but, wonder whether or not this sort of establishment of this partnership just means the beginning of monitoring and surveillance. We know, like it was mentioned earlier, that, the AFP-sponsored Lumad tour that was here last spring, began a wave of red tagging of Filipino activists and legitimate people's organizations who advocate for the rights of Filipinos and for the rights in the Philippines. We saw that there was a wave of red tagging that happened after that. And so we wonder whether or not this will only intensify and increase under this new bill. And for us, instead of prioritizing, intense militarization, billion-dollar arms sales, or clamping down on dissent, we really want to call the Duterte government to focus its attention on the global pandemic of COVID-19 and keeping Filipinos safe and healthy, or perhaps address the growing list of social reforms that are needed, that is growing in social unrest and dissatisfaction. And perhaps they could also, focus their attention on the needs of overseas workers, like the hundreds of J1 workers that were here in the US that were barely paid attention to and left to fend for themselves during this time of, COVID. Malaya clearly opposes the Anti-Terror Act. The Malaya movement clearly opposes the Anti-Terror Act and any legislation, policy, or government order that threatens to weaken or thoroughly dismiss the civil, political, or democratic rights ensured to all Filipinos in the 1987 Philippine Constitution and Bill of Rights. We know, though, that these freedoms were not given freely, but they were won time and time again and defended through the past 122 years dating back to the Philippine Revolution. So, we know that Philippine Independence Day is coming this Friday. We call on all Filipinos in the United States to join us in continuing to defend civil and democratic rights in the Philippines. Malaya movement calls to junk the terror bill now, uphold democracy and freedom, no to dictatorship and fascism, and of course, long live the Filipino people.
Yes, thank you so much, Malaya. And we will go back to Kara, and then following Kara, we'll go into some calls to action from Malaya movement. So Kara, are you there again?
Hello, I'm back. I'm
Okay,
sorry.
great. No problem. Let's see if we can get you to share your screen again.
All right.
Great.
Okay. Are we good?
Yes, we're all good now.
Okay. So going back to what I said earlier, even before the railroading of the anti-terror bill, the youth have been experiencing threats to academic freedom, and even the Commission on Higher Education and the Department of Education were active members of the anti-FLCAC that allowed who had multiple roles in the connivance with the AFP to call student participation and activism. So part of their activities were nationwide red tagging campaign versus youth organizations, progressive leaders, institutions, and in school and launching fora, just to red tag the students, student organizations, and student activists, and calling us brainwashers, accusing us of kidnapping, and even actually filing cases of kidnapping to other student activists. The vilification and closure of Lumad schools and state intervention in the appointment of university officials. And one of the main programs of the Duterte administration is the revival of the mandatory Reserve Officers Training Corps. So before it was mandatory, but then through the youth movement, we were able to junk the mandatory ROTC because of the death of an ROTC cadet who exposed the real happenings inside the ROTC institution, wherein a lot of abuse, sexual abuse, harassment, corruption, and even intelligence on student activists have been happening. So the goal of the Duterte government in reviving the mandatory ROTC is, they say, to instill patriotism and nationalism among the youth, as if this government can actually teach patriotism and nationalism. And it has in fact been conniving, been a puppet to the United States, and accepting gifts and allowing intervention of Chinese vessels and powers in the country. And one also of the main programs of the COMELEC, Smartmatic elect Senator Bato de la Rosa is the Senate Committee Report number 10, which is actually intensifying police visibility, military presence within campuses, military reviewing the academic curriculum and modules, monitoring and evaluation of school activities, and investigation of youth and teachers who are possibly teaching communist or progressive ideologies. So um, recently also the National Youth Commission released a statement. The commission, which is supposed to voice the demands of the youth um, um, against the anti-terror bill, the National Youth Commission released a statement supporting the terror bill, saying that terrorism has destroyed the lives of the youth, kidnapped, killed, harassed many students, destroyed many families. But in fact, it's the Duterte government who has ruined the lives of the youth and the Filipino people. Many lives, Filipino families were ruined. Many lives of the future of the youth is at stake. So some of the pictures here are show how many students have been and youth have been affected by the vilification campaign, by the red tagging campaign of the armed forces of the Philippines. The first picture shows some of the youth, part of the QC18, who have been launching relief operations and community kitchens to help aid the people at the time of the pandemic, and were arrested by the police just because they were doing relief operations. Some of the youth who were voicing out the demands of the people who are against the fascist government, who have been organizing the youth to fight for our democratic rights, were arrested, illegally detained, and even innocent youth such as Kian de los Santos and Carl Ernaiz became victims of the war on drugs campaign of the government. So during the pandemic, one of the main focus of the government is online vilification of online witch hunt and vilification, attacks on the youth, sending death threats, and other forms of harassment on the youth, especially when we were able to protest on ground, to protest against the terror bill. So a lot of fake accounts of individuals surfaced online, flyers against the League of Filipino Students and other progressive organizations were given out to the different parts of the country. Um, uh, Death threats, and which is a not which is a serious thing under the Duterte administration, because if you remember, or if you're familiar with Cacarelets and Jory Porquia, both are champions of human rights. Both have been launching relief operations and community kitchens in the time of the pandemic. Both received death threats before they were murdered in cold blood by suspected military elements. And the recent arrest of Cebu 8 in UP Cebu, and most of the members of Cebu 8 were youth, and one was even a bystander. So, and at the time of the pandemic, the Filipino youth remained at the forefront of the struggle for the democratic rights of the Filipino people. We admit that at the first part of the lockdown, a lot of the protests and avenue for the people and the youth to voice out was the online platform, Facebook, Twitter, social media rallies, online protests, Twitter rallies, um, and a lot of webinars to launch a massive information dissemination campaign regarding the COVID-19 pandemic and the actual solutions, and launching a petition for the 7-point demand of the people, which we considered the urgent demands of the Filipino people regarding the mass testing, medical solutions, social amelioration. But the Duterte government, instead of addressing the needs of the Filipino people, um, um, implemented a military lockdown, which led to countless human rights violations, illegal detention, inhumane punishments to the violators of the lockdown, of the quarantine. And now he's railroading the anti-terror bill, which we think is is actually part of his nuclear arms deal with the United States, that the VFA termination was pure lip service, and then and in exchange for buying missiles and nuclear arms, bombs, and helicopters from the United States was to implement the anti-terror bill in order to further implement neoliberal policies, attacks on the Filipino people, attacks on the workers and the farmers, attacks on the dissent and criticism that he has been receiving since the beginning of his term in the Philippines. So the youth at the forefront of the Filipino at the struggle for for the freedom of the Filipino people, for genuine democracy, for fighting for the democratic rights of the people, will continue and commit our and dedicate their strengths and their lives to the genuine liberation of the Filipino people. And as we quote one of the known youth leaders of the day, as known youth leaders, especially during the Marcos era, only through militant struggle can the best in the youth emerge. And we continue to uphold and live by the challenge to the youth as the hope of the nation.
Thank you so much, Kara Taguao, the national spokesperson of the League of Filipino Students, for really highlighting the impacts on youth and students, but also the bravery and that the youth really are the future who will inherit the Philippines. And so thank you all for sharing on the actions that the youth and students are taking. So I'm sorry that we're a little bit behind schedule. We're just 15 minutes behind. So before we go into the Q&A portion, we do want to leave you with some calls to action. So we hope that everything you heard today about the anti-terror bill, everything you heard about the conditions on the ground in the Philippines, of how activists, human rights defenders, indigenous people, students are impacted and targeted by this anti-terror bill, that it moves you to a place of action. So I'm gonna invite Aves Nabungko, another Malaya Movement National Secretariat member, to speak on our calls to action, and then we'll go into the Q&A.
Thank you, Julie. So, because we're running out of time, thank you so much. As we mentioned in the beginning, right, we're not just here to learn, but really to see the urgency of the situation, right? We cannot just simply keep this knowledge within us, but we must vocalize this, no, and put this into action, right? Some of the actions that we're asking people to do, especially those who live in states where there are Philippine consulates and Philippine embassies. These are the representatives of the Philippine government. No, we encourage everyone to organize actions in the next few days. No, as part of our Independence Day celebrations. What better way to celebrate Independence Day than by asserting, no, the rights and freedoms, no, that our people have fought for. So if feel free to reach out to Malaya Movement if you are interested in planning and organizing events. For folks that are here who are part of institutions, organizations, I know a lot of the Filipino student organizations have already published informational materials online, right? And we salute the youth and students here in the United States for the quick response to that. We encourage everyone to write statements, vocalize your condemnation and your opposition to the anti-terror bill, right? We know that even though we're far away, right, our show of opposition still means a lot and makes an impact, no, in the Philippines. And you know, we also urge people to write, no, directly to the Philippine government, to the Philippine embassy, or call them and let them know about your concern and your outrage against the anti-terror bill. For folks who, you know, we encourage people to create art, media, songs, IG posts, witty Twitter posts. Send them to the Malaya Movement and we'll gladly share them. No, we must utilize the arts not to convey our message. Next slide. Um, and for us here, right, for those who are living in the United States, it is also important, no, to move our representatives here in the United States, our congressmen or our Congress representatives, our senators. We have three simple asks. Well, three asks, right? One is to publicly denounce the anti-terror bill. At the bare minimum, they can send a tweet on their official account, right, saying their condemnation, or they can write an official statement from their office. Two, inform them about tell them to stop the 2 billion arms deal with the Philippines, right? With the anti-terror bill that was railroaded, no, in the Philippines, and the things that we just heard today, right? We know that this 2 billion arms deal will only go to further fueling the human rights violations in the Philippines. And lastly, we want the United States government to end their support to Duterte's dictatorship. And one way we can do that is if these legislators can lend their support in passing the Philippine Human Rights Act. No, you can learn more about the Philippine Human Rights Act by going to the website humanrightsph.org or .net. Yeah, we'll share the information later. And then you can also donate. No, the Malaya movement is committed to supporting our frontline human rights defenders in the Philippines. So if you go on our website, malayamovement.com, there's a button there to donate. You can donate to the Malaya movement, and we will be gathering donations for the rest of the month, no, and direct those to the frontline human rights defenders in the Philippines. Next slide. All right, so I think that is pretty much it from our end in the Malaya movement. We need to be organized. We encourage you all to join the Malaya movement. Email us, yeah, because the situation keeps getting worse, and there's a lot of stuff that we can do here in the United States. But we are stronger if we are organized. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aves, and for everybody for tuning in on this extended online forum. So to move into the Q&A, the first question we are going to ask is directed to our resource speakers in the Philippines, particularly either Jigs or Neri, Colmenares. So now that the anti-terror bill has passed in the House and Senate and has been transmitted to Duterte to sign, when can we expect it to be fully implemented? And if it does get signed into law, what are the prospects of a case being filed in the Supreme Court to fight for its repeal?
Yeah, well, if you ask me, it was transmitted to the President Duterte for signing. If he signs it, it becomes a law 15 days after publication. So if he signs it, say, tomorrow after 15 days, it will become a law. It is effective, as a law. However, the demand is for Duterte to withhold signing the bill, despite the fact that he promoted it. Why? Because we believe that sometimes I have this lesson in Congress when I was in Congress before, and it says, paminsan-minsan ang gobyerno napipilitang gawin ang hindi niya gusto, depende sa pagtutol ng tao sa labas ng Kongreso. So, meaning to say, the protest movement has forced Malacanang, or President Duterte, to backtrack. If you remember the senior citizens complaining about or protesting against the forced quarantine of senior citizens, President Duterte backtracked. The OFWs protesting against the imposition of mandatory premiums on OFWs, President Duterte backtracked. So we're hoping that the protests will make him say, well, let's tackle this later. We're in the midst of pandemic. Anyway, there's a terror law right now, so there's really no pressing need for this. So we hope that the protest will force him into that. However, if he does sign it, then we can challenge it before the Supreme Court. No? And we are already, in fact, discussing and preparing for that. It's a facial challenge, meaning to say we're going to challenge it despite on the basis that it is a threat to freedom of the speech or expression. And Suzanne was here a while ago, and we were discussing with colleagues from the United States on their legal experience as far as the United States is concerned. So basically, that's it. But all this does not mean that the protest movement will wait for the decision of the Supreme Court. As I've always said, the arena for battle is yung tatlong K, Kongreso, Korte, but the most effective battle is usually waged in the calzada or the streets of Manila. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Jigs, did you want to add anything else?
Well, actually, Neri has already said everything. But for us, we would just like to add that we have to continue to monitor whatever developments here in the Philippines are taking place, especially, for example, right now, while the webinar is ongoing, I'm also monitoring the press con of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, because we are awaiting supposedly the decision of the resolution of the petition that we have filed last April 8th with regards to the 22 political prisoners who are asking the court to be released on humanitarian grounds. So we hope that it will turn out positive. In case, we're ready also to assert and do anything we can in order to release the political prisoners here in the Philippines.
Thank you, Jigs. And the next question will go towards Luigi and Kara. So as the human rights violation and repression intensifies, how are activists on the ground adjusting or altering the way they organize and conduct their organizing in communities to maintain their safety? As we know, the anti-terror bill will continue to add more repression. So how are you adjusting your tactics?
Can go first. Since the beginning of the lockdown, we've been holding online orientations, and I can't believe a number of thousands and thousands of youth have registered to the different mass organizations, and new chapters in the different parts of the country were established. So we believe that even amidst the lockdown, we were able to maximize the social media platforms, the Zoom and other video conferences, conference apps, in order to encourage the youth to collectively stand and fight for our rights. So amidst the lockdown, we have communities in the different parts of the country, especially in Metro Manila, where we not only launched community kitchens and relief operations, but also we were able to organize the youth, not only to give relief to the people, but in order for them to be able to understand that relief work does not only end in relief work, but in recognizing the social ills in the country, and to actually fight for the democratic rights of the people. So new chapters have been established. Thousands of youth have joined mass organizations, and thousands have also joined the different webinars, discussions on the COVID-19, on the terror bill, and even the basic courses taken by youth activists in the Philippines.
That's incredible and so wonderful to hear that even amidst a pandemic, crackdowns on activists, that over 1,000 people are attending orientations. That's really powerful. Luigi, would you like to answer as well?
Yeah, sure. Wait, is my camera on? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So as for the protests in real life, like when we go out of the streets, I mean, we actually do social distancing, because I mean, we still don't have mass testing. Like a lot of people are, there's a high unemployment rate, people are losing their jobs, people don't have the money, they can't afford a lot of things. So now we need to do donation drives, and we need to keep on buying things, creating creating masks when we can. And then other than that, we really have to be very aware with halimbawa, since things are both online and offline, since right now we have GCQ, right? General community quarantine, as opposed to the former enhanced community quarantine. Though there is not much difference, there's just like companies now. We have to maximize being both online and offline. So we have to go, let's say, the call for artworks like the ones you're doing in Malaya movement. Then we have bike protests. And then we really have to have this propaganda against the government. Because, like, if you notice, the Duterte government, every Monday or even every day, they hold conferences and even webinars that say that, oh, this is normal, this is all right. But it's not. Okay, it's not. So we have to fight that and let the people, not just through orientations, we have to educate the people that we have to unite, we have to stand in solidarity, not just in the Philippines, but even internationally, that the Duterte, the fascist regimes all over the world and the imperialist regime of the US has to go out, okay? People have to keep on uniting and overthrow all of that. Yeah, so that's it, I guess. Yeah. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much, Luigi. So our next question, I think we're going to do 1 to 2 more questions. It is, a lot of younger Filipinx Americans are especially passionate about Black Lives Matter and prison abolition in a US context. How can we draw connections and solidarities between junk terror bill in the Philippines and prison abolition and Black Lives Matter in the US, especially considering the transnational reach of the US police, military state, and the roots of the Philippine National Police in the US imperialism? So maybe we could direct this to a representative of Malaya movement, either Aves or Malaya. And we would also love to hear from any Philippine speakers who would like to speak on this matter.
Julie, this is the BLM question?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so I think it's clear, at least. I want to give space as well for anyone else in the Secretariat to respond. I mean, it's a big question. I think clearly that there are misuse and overuse of state fascism and military might during times of peaceful protest, during times of legitimate dissent against ongoing social injustice. I think those parallels are very clear. I think what's also very clear in the parallels is that there is also ongoing social unrest because there are needs of the community, of working class and poor people, Black and Filipino, that have been neglected and dismissed, and you know, the use of military might to silence that. I think clearly, as a movement of Filipinos who stand for, for democracy in the Philippines, who continue a fight against fascism in the tradition of those who stood up against fascism during martial law. We cannot turn a blind eye to the state fascism that is being sanctioned here in the US against our Black community, and sanctioned by state police. So, I mean, I think that those are very clear, parallels between those two. And so, as a movement for rights in the Philippines, we stand in solidarity because we know we don't live in bubbles. We live in an interconnected world. We live in a society where we all need to cooperate with each other. And so in that ways, I think that there are lots of parallels and bridges. I don't know if Yves or anyone else wants to respond.
Yeah, thank you, Malaya. Just to add, the connection is not just on the level of parallels, but a material connection, to the oppression and exploitation of the Black community, the indigenous communities here in the United States. The wealth and the power of this country, of the United States, was built on the backs and the exploited labor of the Black community through slavery. The establishment of the United States was conducted, no, at the cost, no, at the genocide of the indigenous peoples here in the United States. So there is the material basis there. Without those, the United States will not reach the level that it is now, no, that it's able to impose its policies, economic and political and military, in the Philippines, no. Therefore, as the Malaya movement, we must understand this connection, and we must help in educating our community, no, in this material and concrete, tangible connection, and not just in the past, but in the current situation, no. As Malaya have already mentioned, the Philippine National Police and the various police departments here in the United States continue to conduct joint trainings, no. The tactics that are being used by the Philippine National Police, that the Philippine National Police, who have murdered already more than 30,000 Filipinos, are being exchanged, no, with the New York City Police Department, with the San Diego Police Department. The United States continues to fund, no, the terrorist acts of the Duterte government in the Philippines, using the tax dollars extracted from the labor of the Black community and the people of color of this country. So the connections are clear. Therefore, our task as Filipinos and as human rights defenders, whether here in the United States or in the Philippines or any part of the world, is to extend concrete, tangible solidarity, engage in joint actions, and engage in joint campaigns, and educate our community.
Yeah, just a short note. A few days ago, after the arrests in Cebu of the students, a former congressman called me up. He was one of the leaders of Gloria Arroyo during the days of Gloria Arroyo. And he said, I noticed there are a lot of rallies going on. And he said, is this our I Can't Breathe movement? Is this our action, Black Lives Matter action? So, and he said, I'd like to join the next rally. So that shows that the actions of the people of the United States do inspire, in fact, struggles from other countries. So in fact, the reference to your movement there has made a strong impact on many of us here. So maybe I just like to conclude on the point that, yes, your struggles for the lives of the Filipino people impact a lot on us, together with us, but also your moves for social reform in the United States will also have a lot of impact on countries like the Philippines. For after all, the United States remains one of the most powerful influencers in Philippine society until today. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you
I'd
so
like,
much. Okay,
is it
go
all
ahead.
right? I'll add something. Yeah. I think I'd rather like talk about the connection about the oppression of Black people and Filipino people, all Asians. Like, as long as you're not like, you're a person of color. Yeah. So I'd like to quote the Black Panther Party. And again, an attack against one is an attack against all. Because racism has been rampant in the United States since the feudal ages of society, right? And because of that, white supremacy became a fundamental aspect of U.S. colonization until the emergence of capitalist modern society. And so, since the U.S. is actually one of the strongest imperialist power in the world, white supremacy continues to influence world culture, right? And so the bursary universalizes the idea of anti-Blackness and state violence, rationalizing them, all the while emphasizing a civil society. And so this creates a divide between races and ethnicities, making Black, Asians, brown communities fight each other. But we shouldn't do that, because we shouldn't be blinded by the cultural norms set up by imperialist US. And in the face of police brutality, which we have been in the Philippines, we have been experiencing for such a long time, and even in the US, this is state repression, right? We have to stand in solidarity with each other as we both struggle for self-determination, that we want to break free from US imperialism, right? So, wait lang. So, if the oppressor dictates the nature of struggle, and imperialist US terrorizes the world with colonial and neoliberal policies and threatens to start another war or even another counterinsurgency program, a Red Scare once more, then we have to fight for national democracy because revolutions against US imperialism have risen across the globe. So we should not keep the oppressors comfortable in power. We have to overthrow US imperialism and all imperialist lapdogs, just like Duterte, okay? We have to resist state violence, resist police brutality, resist white supremacy, because the people united will never be defeated. And we have to believe that all power is to the people. Because we are the true bearers of power, for the state cannot exist without its people. There. Thank you. I'm so sorry. Sobrang agit ko lang talaga about that. Yun.
Yeah.
Hindi
I'd
naman
like
Oh,
I'd also like to add something, if I may.
go ahead, and then we'll
Yeah.
wrap up.
Yeah. So we believe that the Justice for George Floyd movement, Black Lives Matter, um, is a is not only is not only a historical struggle of the of the Black community and not only in the United States. It also comes from the anger that roots from the incompetent response of the Trump administration to the pandemic and what it has done, very similar to Duterte, and the rise of police brutality all over the world, not only in US, not only in the Philippines, and even in Hong Kong and in different parts of the world. It only shows that the police as an institution and the military as an institution are institutions of a reactionary state, a bourgeois democratic state, and the intensification of brutality, the rise of fascism all over the world. It signifies the worsening global capitalist crisis, and because of the global capitalist crisis, the people all over the world are experiencing hunger, poverty, attacks on the democratic rights of the people all over the world, and as we say, crisis generates resistance. And in order for the bourgeois democratic states, such as the Trump administration, the Duterte administration, to silence dissent, to curtail the silence criticisms, to curtail resistance, to end the resistance of the people against the kind of system that has led to this inequality, poverty, and injustice. They're um, they're employing brutality, fascism, fascist policies, and actually weaponizing the law and allowing the police and the military to have more powers in order to silence the people. So it's not only a struggle, or it's not only a call or a recognition that all cops are bastards. It's not only a recognition that fascism all over the world is are rising, but it's also a note in a turn in history, wherein we are welcoming another downturn of the global capitalist system and the rise of democratic and liberation and resistances all over the world.
Thank you so much to all our incredible speakers. May we continue offering our solidarity, not only from the United States here in the fight for Black liberation and for Black lives, but also for the freedom and democracy of the Filipino people who are really facing such a dire situation under the Duterte regime with this recent passing of the anti-terror bill, but also the continued systemic issues that have not yet been resolved. So to end our online forum for today, please remember to take all the calls to action into mind. raise your condemnation as far and wide as you can. And really, like all of the speakers shared today, it takes people's movements, it takes organization, and that at the end of the day, when we band together, we are mightier than any police force or any repression that is held against us. So we must continue to rise up together. So please join Malaya Movement if you're not already a member. We have chapters all across the United States, from the Northeast to the Midwest, to the Pacific Northwest, California, Texas, the Delaware, Maryland, Virginia area. And if you don't see a chapter listed here on the screen, please contact us at malayamovement@gmail.com, and we will gladly help set up an organization of a Malaya Movement chapter with you. So next slide. And then these are just some activities that are already happening. Some Malaya chapters have already created events and activities to demand an end to the terror bill, to junk the terror bill. So whether it's in Los Angeles, there will be a community caravan and rally to stop Duterte's acts of terror on June 14th at 2 p.m. And also, we have on Friday, June 12th, there'll be another action by Malaya South Bay at 5 p.m. And can we hit the next slide? I think there are 2 more events we would like to prop. And our chapter in Texas for Independence Day, there'll be an online forum on sovereignty and human rights on the Philippines on June 13th on Saturday. And also Malaya Movement in San Francisco will have a new members orientation via Zoom on June 12th. So yes, please stay connected and remember to junk terror bill, use the hashtag and mobilize and take action against this repressive bill. So thank you all for tuning in today, and thank you to all of our speakers. Be well, stay safe, and we'll continue organizing. Thank you.
Thank you. Isang taas kamaong pagpupugay sa inyong lahat. Salamat galing sa YouTube.
Salamat din sa inyong lahat.
Thank you.
Salamat.
Maraming salamat. Thank you.
Yay.